So I came across this article recently that alleges that Michael Jackson ripped off Rick James for one of his biggest songs. That's a bold claim. The king of pop stealing from the super freak? Sorry, no one calls him that. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, I started to pull the thread. I read the article, did some more research, kept pulling that thread, ended up uncovering another suspiciously similar set of songs between these two. But then I kept going, all the way back through other artists, other genres, until I got to the origins of the bass. Once the whole thing was unraveled, I had my answer, and then continued on forward through music history and making a few fun mashups along the way. And now that I've come back from this thread-pulling journey, I'd like to take you back with me, and as we answer one question about Michael, we'll end up answering a few more, uncovering why funk and soul music loves the key of E minor so much. Alright, so first, this article. Here it is, titled, "Did Michael Jackson Rip Off Rick James for Billie Jean?" Basically, this article is alleging that when Michael made Billie Jean, he was ripping off the Rick James song Ghetto Life. Now, when I listen to both of these songs, the only similarity I hear is the drums right at the beginning, but that's a very basic beat. You know the drums at the beginning of Billie Jean? That's essentially what's at the beginning of Ghetto Life, but just for a couple seconds, and then the rest of the song is completely different. It's not even worth jumping through the whole YouTube copyright hoops to show you. I'll put it in the Spotify playlist for this video if you want to check it out, but I don't think there's really anything here. Oh, but the article goes on. They got this tip from a hot source. Jeffrey Phillips, who is the ex-fiance of Michael's sister, LaToya. Okay, kind of seems too far removed from Michael to actually mean anything, but what did he say? He says that Rick James told him on multiple occasions that Billie Jean was a ripoff of Ghetto Life. Apparently, Michael called Rick to tell him how much he liked his album Street Songs and wanted to come see Rick in the studio and see how he worked. Shortly after that, Billie Jean came out. Ooh, the smoking gun. When Rick confronted Michael about it at an award show, Michael apparently laughed and just said, "Good to see you, Rick." Alright, so we pulled the thread on this, and honestly, I don't hear that big of a similarity. No matter what Michael's sister's former masseuse's ex-second cousin's adoptive son says that Rick James said. But this article references something else, a Quincy Jones interview where he alleges Michael stole from Donna Summer for Billie Jean. Let's keep pulling this thread. If you haven't read this interview with Quincy Jones, you really need to, because, look at me, it's absolutely bonkers. All respect to Quincy, but he does not hold back on saying what he thinks about Michael, how legendary his own work is, and how he dated Ivanka Trump. Seriously, it's wild. Anyway, in the article, Quincy says that Michael stole a lot of songs, specifically citing the Donna Summer song State of Independence as something Michael stole for Billie Jean. This is another one that I can hear the influence, but State of Independence is in a major key, Billie Jean is minor, and while the bass line is similar, I definitely wouldn't say it was stolen. Both of these allegations were based on a drum groove and a bass line, and both don't really hold up under closer inspection, but what about a chord progression? Taking out the specifics of what the instruments are playing, if the chord progression is similar, the two songs could sound the same. Like if you take Michael's Workin Day and Night and Mary Jane by Rick James. In this case, the drums and the tempos are different and the bass lines aren't the same, but both are in the key of E minor and both have very similar chord progressions. They're based around this E minor to A7 progression. Workin Day and Night sneaks in a quick D major between the two, but basically this E minor moving to A7 progression loops back and forth, and that's the bulk of the song. There are a lot of other elements to both songs, other shorter sections, horns or flutes, background vocals, etc., but at the core here is this E minor to A7 and back groove. And if you keep pulling the thread, Workin Day and Night came out in 1979, while Mary Jane came out in 1978. At least that's what LaToya's niece's best friend's sister's Dr. Siri told me. So with the core of these songs so similar, I decided to mix them together and have a little fun. Maybe this is what Michael had in his head when he was writing Workin Day and Night, or what Rick imagined when he heard Michael's song. I want to say a quick thank you to Lolol.ai for sponsoring this video. If you've ever tried to do a remix or mashup like I just did, and I'm gonna do again in a minute, you've probably Googled something like this song a cappella. Oftentimes the studio a cappella isn't available, but you've probably come across Lolol.ai. Rather than using the old school method of using phase or EQ to get rid of the vocal, this is a next generation music source separation service that uses AI for fast, easy, and precise stem extraction. Let me show you how it works. Let's start with this song. Now let's say I want to isolate the drums out of this. All you have to do is drop the original track in and the service goes to work. I can click through to hear a preview of the different stem separation options and download them individually from there. So let's hear how the drums turned out. Lolol.ai also has a referral program where you can earn 5 free minutes of song splitting for every user that signs up through your link. Plus, your signups get 10 free minutes. Go check out Lolol.ai through the link in the description. So, did Michael steal this song from Rick James? These two songs are similar enough to make a fun remix, but then again, I've heard that E minor to A7 progression before. So then the question becomes, well, where did Rick James get the progression? There are a lot of songs that use this progression that came out even after Workin Day and Night, and plenty before. Another One Bites the Dust by Queen, Good Times by Chic, and by extension, Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang all use the same progression, and all came after Mary Jane. One that came before Mary Jane is the Bill Withers song Use Me. This song is from 1972 and is based around these same two chords, E minor and A7. So yeah, I did the same thing and went, well, if Rick James was inspired by Bill Withers, what would that sound like if we mashed those up? So this E minor to A7 progression is very common, especially in funk and soul music, but let's keep pulling that thread. Why is it so common? The easy answer is because it's easy to play on the bass, and sure, but let's keep pulling that thread. Why is it easier to play on the bass? To answer this question, we have to take it all the way back to the beginning of the bass before there even was an E string to play. And actually, that wasn't that long ago. The exact dates on all of this aren't clear, so I'm gonna summarize. In the 1600s, the core string instruments in an orchestra were violin, viola, and cello. But then someone thought it would be a good idea to play that same cello part, but double it, playing it down an octave to thicken up the sound. That's where the name double bass comes from. It's doubling the cello part, but down an octave. By the way, classical players will call it the double bass. Non-classical players will call it the upright bass, but most people just call it the big one. This is the origin of the bass as we know it today. But here's the thing with doubling the cello part. The low string on a cello is a C, so that's technically the lowest that the bass would need to go. But for whatever reason, they decided to throw in a couple extra notes in there and go all the way down to A. That's 3 extra notes you don't technically need, but it's the very first step in evolving the instrument beyond its cello roots and into something of its own. The double bass has different tuning than the cello, with a low string of A and then a D and a G. But that's it, only 3 strings. There was no E string at this point. I know that seems crazy, but that's what the bass was for a long time. One of the first bass virtuosos in the late 1700s, Domenico Dragonetti, played a 3-string bass that's still on display at the San Marco Basilica in Venice, Italy. I know you were not expecting to see a picture of a centuries-old double bass when you clicked on this video about Michael Jackson and Rick James, but here we are. And I promise this is all circling back in just a second. Dragonetti's important, and not just because he has a badass name. He was friends with Beethoven, who was one of the first composers to write double bass parts independent from the cello. And maybe because they were friends, Beethoven's bass parts are new, interesting, and hard to play. Still to this day, if you want to play double bass in a major orchestra, you're going to be playing some Beethoven bass excerpts at the audition. This is another step in the evolution of the bass, a separate bass line. Moving through music history some more, the bass continues playing a supportive role in the orchestra, and more composers see it as its own instrument, continuing to expand what they write for the bass, and finally, in the 1800s, that low E string becomes standard on the double bass. But remember, these composers don't necessarily play the bass themselves, and they're writing for an orchestra with a lot of different instruments. They're just gonna write it in whatever key they want, not necessarily what lays out well on the instrument. Put a pin in this idea because it's a crucial reason why, centuries later, Rick James and Michael Jackson picked E minor for their respective songs. Fast forward some more, the double bass comes to America and branches off in folk music, blues, bluegrass, jazz, etc., and begins mingling with the guitar. In 1935, we get the Model 736 bass fiddle from Audiovox, which is the first solid body electric bass guitar. It's got frets like a guitar, a single pickup, and the crazy thing is that it was advertised as being great for orchestral use, saying that it can take the place of 3 double basses. So it's an electric bass that kinda looks like a guitar but is being thought of as an orchestral instrument. In 1951, the Fender Precision bass emerges. Similar to the Model 736, the big selling point here is it's easier to carry than your giant double bass, and it also has frets, so it's easier to play than the big bass. But the Fender P bass isn't trying to replace the orchestral bass. It's trying to be an easy alternative to the jazz upright bass. In 1953, Montgomery became the first bassist to tour with the Fender bass with Lionel Hampton's big band. At this point, the Fender bass isn't really its own instrument, it's just an easier alternative to the double bass. And then we get to funk. The song that is most often credited as the first funk song is Papa's Got a Brand New Bag by James Brown. This song came out in 1965, and we can start to hear that electric bass grooving differently than the double bass. It's becoming its own instrument. It's become self-aware. It's hunting for sport. Funk keeps going and is very bass-driven, and if the bass player's in charge of the groove, they're probably going to put it in a key that's easy to groove in. All of the open strings, E, A, D, and G, work in the key of E minor, plus you've got that low E, so E minor just makes sense. Funk keeps evolving, and this fresh new take on the bass carries over to other genres too, like soul and disco. That's why Papa's Got a Brand New Bag is in E minor, why Use Me is in E minor, why Play That Funky Music, Give Up the Funk, Hollywood Swingin', and so many more are in E minor. The instrument that started as simply doubling another line down an octave has evolved to be able to play even lower. It's gone electric, and for the first time in music history with funk and soul music, the bass isn't just playing second fiddle anymore. Pun intended. The bass is front and center. It's the primary instrument driving the song, and if the bass is in charge, we're gonna do something that only the bass can do. That delicious low E string. Also, yeah, it makes my fingies hurt less. So when Rick James sits down to write Mary Jane in 1978, of course he's gonna put it in E minor. It lays out perfectly on the bass. And then when Michael sits down to write Workin Day and Night, maybe he had Mary Jane in mind, I don't know, but more than that, he wants it to be funky, so he puts it in the key where funk lives. And he goes with a super common chord progression that he's heard many times before. The big difference here is he's not actually using an electric bass or a double bass. He's using an instrument one more evolutionary step down the line, the synth bass. Louis Johnson's bass track on this song only has electric bass on the bridge when he's slapping. The rest of it is synth bass. Off the Wall is such a great album because it's so many things. It's Michael's first grown-up album as a solo act, separate from the Jackson 5. The songs and arrangements are incredible, and it serves as the perfect bridge between the era it's coming out of and the era it's going into. And nowhere is that clearer than on the song Rock With You, but for that story, you gotta watch this video.